Welcome to the Anime Audiophile Podcast. Please like and subscribe for more. Thank you. Kakashi Retsuden, the Sixth Hokage and the Fail Prince. Chapter 4. In the middle of the night, Naruto, Kakashi, and the villagers gathered in front of the mud wall. It would be dawn in a few hours. Fortunately, the moon was hidden behind thick clouds. The poor visibility worked in their favor. They had the advantage of knowing the terrain. Everyone's been evacuated. Communications Officer Margot came to Naruto to report. Thanks. You should evacuate now too, he told her. Margot was not in favor of disobeying the Prime Minister, and as such she was supposed to evacuate to the rear with all the other villagers who were opposed. But in the end, she shook off her opposition and put the pot in her hands on her head as armor. I'm going to fight. If I let you fight all by yourself and live to return to the capital, I could never show my face again. Naruto swallowed the urge to ask if she was sure and nodded. Margot wasn't alone. The other villagers there were all wearing pots or baskets on their heads and were armed with makeshift weapons. They clutched hoes and scythes, and full leather water bags hung from their waists. The strategy was simple. Kakashi would take on the shinobi. During that time, the villagers would infiltrate the encampment and with the ammunition powder needed to fire the cannons, rendering it useless. Meanwhile, Naruto would go off on his own to look for the queen and persuade her to abandon the advance. You're all ready then? Kakashi asked, and the party nodded. He locked his hands together in front of his chest. THWWM. The earth shook silently. The wall in front of them began to break down, crumbling to pieces. The mud wall technique had been released. Let's go! Naruto leaped forward. Sumire was quick to follow, and the other villagers ran behind them. The camp was quiet. The majority of the shinobi not on guard duty were asleep in their tents. Who? An owl called. One man had left his tent to answer the call of nature when he felt the earth shudder. For a moment, he wondered if the mud wall technique had been undone, but the vibration was far too small for that. The release of the chakra to create a wall that huge would come with some serious shaking and a loud roar. Even if the ninja who wielded it was a true master, he probably just had too much to drink and stumbled a bit. Assured, the man leisurely finished his business and headed back to his tent. And stopped in his tracks. The earth-style wall around the village had been released. Wah! To be more precise, it had melted away. The mud wall had been large enough to surround an entire village, and yet each and every one of those grains of sand had quietly vanished, simply disappearing in the air. Without even a puff of dust. This was incredible chakra control. Lost in admiration, the rogue ninja was caught unaware when someone hit him abruptly from behind. His knees gave out and he crumpled to the ground. Caw! It was a hoarse attempt at signaling alarm. His body was numb to the core. He couldn't move a single finger. The last thing he saw from behind his descending eyelids was a ninja with hair that was silver like a wolf shining in the moonlight and a gaze sleepy like a goat's. The rogue shinobi that the Prime Minister had assembled lacked a cohesive ethos that would inspire them to fight or protect. They were simply mercenaries. They would, of course, dutifully carry out their mission even if it meant sacrificing their lives, but such sacrifice was not preferred. On the other hand, the peasants who carried the cannons on the long road to protect the capital had greater morale. The shinobi standing watch on the east side of the encampment was charged to monitor the village and look for any subtle movement. However, they were much more engrossed in a game of shogi than in keeping an eye out for enemy action. Who's winning? Not sure here, the man replied absent-mindedly, completely caught up in the game. As he stared at the board, he suddenly wondered who had just spoken, and he lifted his head. He saw his opponent across from him frothing at the mouth. The man who had been watching the contest from behind him was on the ground. He felt a slight impact on the back of his neck, and the game piece dropped from his hand as he flopped forward on the board. Meanwhile, the three shinobi keeping watch on the north side were somewhat more serious about their duties than the men on the east side. They turned their attention to the wall around the village from time to time, but they were mainly watching the cliff to the north, with the idea that the villagers might take a detour and come around that way. I can't believe this village has an ally like that, a shinobi so amazing they can keep a mud wall that big going for this long. Nah, there's no way it's just one person. It's gotta be a combo technique with a bunch of shinobi. I guess maybe. As they chatted, one of the men casually looked over his shoulder. The mud wall was blanketed in darkness, and he couldn't see it. But he sensed people moving between the village and the encampment. He stood up with a gasp, raised his torch, and narrowed his eyes. And realized that the mud wall had come down. Oi! The villagers' dash are moving, the man started to say when someone grabbed him firmly from behind. A fist hit him squarely in the chest, knocking the air out of his lungs and dragging his consciousness along with it. You say something? Just as his remaining comrades also noticed something was off, hands abruptly clamped onto their heads and slammed them together. A dull conk. Knocked unconscious in a mutual headbutt, the two ninja rolled their eyes back and passed out. Kakashi stamped out the light of the lookout's torch. The Prime Minister had hired 50 shinobi in total. 43 to go then, he muttered and dropped the two now lump-headed shinobi to the ground. Then he pulled the headband with the mark of Konoha down diagonally to cover his left eye before turning and sneaking toward the silent tents. The Prime Minister's shinobi were not a gang of weaklings. They had made it this far as rogue shinobi without dying, so they couldn't have been novice jutsu users. Kakashi held his breath and slipped inside a tent. There were 10 shinobi inside, all dozing, sitting with one knee up or cross-legged. This was a group that had trained awake at the sound of a cat step. He made himself invisible and slid among them, still holding his breath, and carefully landed a hand strike on each enemy's neck from one end to the other. The sleep-inducing chakra point Irika had taught him was helpful. The technique rendered enemies helpless without killing them. Before he became Hokage, Kakashi had only known how to kill people. He had methods of capturing people without killing them, but they all involved pain and torture. But as time wore on and the country grew stable, the shinobi principle of capture without killing had taken favor. And it was none other than the 6th Hokage himself who had struggled with how to write the guidelines for this new no-kill capture policy. He discussed it with Irika, the principal of the academy at the time, and he had laughed. Kakashi remembered every single word of what he said. It's okay. It might not look it, but we do more than just teach students at the academy. We've saved jutsu to make an enemy fall asleep instantly or freeze them on the spot. Everything from old to new is right here. Distracted by the memory of Irika's proud face, Kakashi accidentally allowed a bit of fabric to rustle while strangling the 9th shinobi. A man sleeping further back in the tent with one knee up snapped his eyes open at the sound, and as soon as he saw Kakashi, started thrusting a hand into his jacket to pull out a dagger. He whirled around, slashed the tent open, and shouted, "Intruder! Wake up!" Kakashi's hand came down over the man's mouth. He used his other hand to strangle him to unconsciousness. After a few seconds, the body grew limp and fell to the ground, and Kakashi stepped outside through the opening the man had cut in the tent. Men in shinobi garb were lined up before him. 5, he guessed. Before they were joined by another 2 to become 7. Ah, everyone's awake now. The camp was no longer quiet. The cacophony came from the non-shinobi soldiers. It's an enemy attack. Put out the torches. No, don't do that. They ran around in confusion, causing chaos. Meanwhile, the 7 shinobi who had arrived first on the scene said nothing as they carefully closed the distance between themselves and Kakashi. He wanted a weapon. He groped around and touched a pot hanging under one of the watchfire baskets. He frowned. Well, I guess this'll do. It had been a while since he fought against shinobi, but he didn't have the time to have a nice leisurely go of it. He was 1 against 50. If he didn't settle this before it turned into a group brawl, he might not make it out unscathed. Let's get to it then, Kakashi said to himself and kicked at the ground. Just one? The shinobi man had raced over when he heard the news but snorted in disdain when he saw the intruder. Wandering on his own without a plan, surrounded by a group of ninja in the blink of an eye, this guy was no great threat. He was tall if nothing else, but he looked sort of sleepy. Even as he mentally let his guard down, the man unsheathed his sword cautiously. He held it low in front of him and dropped into a crouch. He imagined thrusting it into the stomach of the man before him, slicing him in two, and licked his lips. Clang! One of his comrades was suddenly on his back. He suddenly felt a powerfully bloodthirsty presence before him. He quickly looked back and found the intruder standing there. A fist slammed into his side, and his hand let go of the hilt of his sword. He's going to kill me. He braced himself for death as he crumpled to the ground, but the intruder pulled away for some reason. He pitched forward to pick up his sword and readied it in front of him once more, back against the wall. Clang! He heard the metallic sound again from somewhere, and another of his allies dropped, hands still clasped together about to weave a sign. A flat piece of metal flashed briefly in the darkness. What was that? A disc weapon? Clang! The sound rang out again, and a shinobi clutching a kunai staggered and fell. This time, he saw it clearly. The ninja had been hit by a pot lid, the iron kind used for cooking rice. When the rice got stuck to it, it was almost impossible to get off. He hated that. A pot lid? Clang clang. Two faces, eyes rolling back in their heads, slammed into the ground. The pot lid left a silver afterimage before melting once more into the darkness. The man readied his blade, unable to process the fact that his comrades were being taken down one after the other by a pot lid. It must have been some amazing pot lid that used chakra. That had to be it. The tip of his blade wiggling, he inched backward. His back touched the wooden post of the tripod that held the watchfire pot. Where's he coming from? He murmured to himself. And then he heard a sixth clang and the sound of his ally hitting the dirt. At last, a cold sweat sprang up on his forehead. He was the only one still standing. In mere seconds, a fight that started as 7 against 1 had turned into a one-on-one battle. In the darkness, his whole body on high alert, blood vessels threatening to boil over, he peered out into the area. All his comrades had been felled with a single blow. If he got hit now, it was all over. Ayu! He felt iron cut through the air above his head. Gah! The man thrust the sword he was holding in reverse upward, half crazed. He felt it hit. He saw the pot lid fly off, repelled by the tip of his blade. He felt a surge of excitement. He'd won. His guard loosened, even though he hadn't confirmed his win yet. He felt a weight on his chest and looked down to find a kunai thrust deep into his heart. He was about to cry out in shock and pain when the kunai vanished. He realized it was Jinjutsu, but he was still baffled for a moment. That was all it took. A half-second later, he took a palm strike to his neck and lost consciousness. So that's 26 more to go. Kakashi picked up the weapon that had been knocked away and let out a sigh. The rounded pot lid had performed surprisingly well, but it had indeed been unable to withstand that last sword strike. It was now squashed flat. Might be good against bullets, he assessed optimistically and tucked it away in his pocket for now. Now that he'd gone up against a few of these shinobi, it seemed their average ability was on the special jonin level. They were weak, and a couple had more advanced abilities he expected in a rogue shinobi, but to Kakashi, they were a group of small-time punks. Well, that last one with the sword handled himself pretty well, I guess. Because the man had shown surprising tenacity, Kakashi had been forced to use Jinjutsu and exhaust his little remaining chakra, although he'd hoped to keep aside at least a bit for when he faced the Prime Minister. He could sense more shinobi charging in, so Kakashi quenched his aura and slid into the darkness once more. The 6 shinobi were all in a group, compensating for each other's blind spots and watching the area carefully. It hadn't even been a minute since they heard the voice, shouting about an intruder. And in that same time, 7 of their comrades had lost consciousness. Probably the Land of Fire or a shinobi from a country around there, the man running in the lead muttered. Yes, said a younger man who was not far behind him. None of their fallen comrades had been dealt a killing blow. It would have been faster and easier for this intruder to just kill, and yet he didn't. Such eccentric behavior could only have been a shinobi from one of the 5 great nations centered around the Land of Fire. 7 guys taken out at one time means there's probably more than one intruder. At least 3, no, 4, maybe. Yeah. There was barely any sign of resistance either, so they likely took 1 man each and thrashed them. Our enemy's sharp, to be sure, but that doesn't change the fact that there are more of us. When the group passed by, the watchfire in the iron pot swung wildly and fell. One of the shinobi should have caught it and hung it back up. But the young man closest to it pulled back, afraid of burning his hands. The burning wood scattered all over the ground. The fire continued to burn on the sand, but their surroundings grew noticeably darker. Suddenly unable to see, the shinobi were late to react to the shadow that cut in front of them. Whud! Something hard hit the skull of the man in the lead, and his eyes rolled back as he fell down. The limp bodies of his comrades landed on his chest one after the other. 1, 2, 3, 4 people. The young man became the last one standing when he heard the 5th man next to him get cracked on the head. Ah, another one wrecked, the intruder said with a sigh and tossed something aside. The young man wasn't so foolish as to follow it with his gaze and create an opening for the intruder to attack, but he did catch it out of the corner of his eye. Maybe it was just his imagination, but it looked like a crushed pot. He didn't have the luxury of double-checking. Gripping a kunai, the man faced off against the intruder. You scoundrel, disobeying the queen. I'm not letting you leave alive. He was trying to be threatening, but his voice shook. Face to face with the intruder on his own, he felt the waves of intimidation and understood for the first time that his opponent was a monster on an entirely different level. The intruder had his face covered with a headband and a mask over his mouth, so the young man couldn't really see what he looked like. But he felt like he had seen him somewhere before. If this masked intruder was a shinobi famous enough to cover his face, he as a rogue shinobi would be outmatched. He would have already fled, but he had a duty to hold the intruder's attention for as long as possible, until backup arrived. I'm not letting you leave alive, he spat again and dropped his hips. He had given up on using jutsu. The intruder was too well guarded, and he was pretty sure he wouldn't even get the chance to finish weaving a sign. The intruder was silent. Apparently, he had no intention of making pointless talk and buying some time. The young man readied his kunai in front of him and stared at the intruder unblinking. Clank! Something twisted around his ankle, and in the next breath, his body was dancing up into the air. Yanked up off the ground by a weighted chain, the young man caught sight of a new comrade charging in out of the corner of his eye. He threw a shuriken, and the intruder grabbed the shoulders of the man hanging in space, pushing him forward. Is he using me as a shield against the shuriken? But the intruder only caught the incoming shuriken with the long fingers extending from his glove and tossed it back. He thought when he was hit in the back of the neck. Still not understanding what was going on, he slipped out of consciousness like he was falling into a deep sleep. The shuriken the intruder threw back went through the man's foot. He lost his balance and reeled helplessly backward. In the blink of an eye, the intruder closed the distance between them and ripped into him with a knee strike. The intruder dodged another shinobi coming at him with a punch as he stuck out a foot and tripped him, without a hint of malice, before melting into the darkness once more. No spreading out. Stick together. No blind spots. Roars echoed in the night, and the shinobi put their backs together, on guard in all directions. Where's he going to come from? Came a murmur from somewhere. The moonlight flickered ever so slightly in the shadow cast by the Wall. There. One man grabbed the neck of a smaller comrade beside him and threw him as hard as he could toward the base of the fence. The shadow shuddered, and the intruder flew out, sidestepping the small man and leaping off to one side. The small ninja, abruptly used as a projectile, nevertheless quickly adapted to the situation, kicking at the wall to change his position and fly at the intruder. He pulled a cloth from his jacket as a blind and immediately wove a sign. The small man's specialty was wind style. He would launch a low-pressure cyclone and use the difference in air pressure to crush his enemy's windpipe. A wind-style air current began to rotate turbulently between the hands he held in front of his chest. Unfortunately for him, however, the intruder was faster than the wind. His knee dug into the small man's groin, causing him to groan helplessly. The back of his neck was wide open. A palm strike came down on it, and he groaned no more. The shinobi to the rear had finished weaving his signs. The spear he held was suddenly wrapped in blue flames from handle to tip. Fire style. Fire spear. Get ready, he barked and charged the intruder. Two of his comrades readied their swords to either side of him and provided backup. If the three of them flew at the intruder at the same time, at least one of them would graze him with a blade. He expected the intruder to use the small unconscious man as a shield and come at them, but he didn't do that. The small man still flat on the ground, the intruder tossed a small white ball down at his feet. There was an explosion, and the area was blanketed in smoke. Bad move, guy. The spearman grinned. Maybe the intruder had used the smoke bomb out of desperation, but it only gave him and his comrades the advantage. In a situation like this, it was the intruder who would end up having nowhere to run. The flame-covered spear slashed horizontally. Through the opening in the smoke, he saw one of his comrades collapse. The intruder moved slowly behind him. From the movement of his eyes, he could tell that he was gauging the temperature and air pressure of the burning spear. In a flash, the man on the left attacked with his sword. The intruder quickly pulled a kunai from the pocket of the fallen man and caught the blow, but the man on the left pushed back and sliced at his jacket. But the intruder fled upward, moving like an animal, and of all things, came to stand on the wrist of the man holding the sword. The man's face drooped, like all the fight had gone out of him. He felt the weight on his wrist, followed by a kick slammed into his face, and then he passed out. Now it was one-on-one. Only the man with the spear was still standing. Smoke blocking his field of view, the intruder whirled around and sent his gaze to the rear. The spear stood upright in the earth, still burning. For the first time, the eyes of the expressionless intruder widened. Gotcha! The shinobi sliced at the intruder from his blind spot with a short spear. The intruder reacted to the wind pressure and whirled around, but he was just barely too late. While he'd been dispatching the men with swords charging from either side, the intruder had been keeping an eye on the position of the flaming lance. The shinobi had dared to toss it away to use as a decoy, so that he could get the back of this fearsomely sharp intruder for even just a second. Up. The naked blade caught the intruder's throat, and fresh blood welled. I win. A moment after he declared his victory, something drove deep into his solar plexus. He fell forward into the drops of blood and realized he'd taken a knee strike. He was certain that he'd cut the man's throat, and yet it was the thigh of his fallen comrade spurting blood. Jinjutsu? He dropped a knee to the ground and gasped when he saw the face of the intruder through the smoke for the first time. Shockingly silver hair and sharp eyes reminiscent of a bird of prey. Strong features stood out clearly through the cloth covering his face, and a headband worn diagonally to hide the left eye. The spear user shinobi had seen this face any number of times in broadcasts of the Five Shadows Summit, in articles about the retirement of the 6th Hokage. You can't be. The intruder was the 6th Hokage. He had to tell his comrades right away, but the problem was that the man could no longer so much as twitch. The sweet scent of the smoke bomb had seeped deep into his bones, and his thoughts quickly receded. At the same time as the man let go of consciousness, the flaming spear in the ground went out with a whine. 14 left. Blood in his silver hair, the intruder emerged from the white smoke shimmering like a mirage. He lowered a blood-stained blade, and one side of his face was covered in a blood splatter. A man watched, the nail to be hammered into this chilling figure, the living personification of an evil spirit. There was no mistake. It was the sixth Hokage. Itachi Kakashi. The man never dreamed he would meet him in a place like this. He licked his lips where he hid in the leafy branches. His heart wouldn't stop pounding. It was like the blood flowing through his body had turned into cheap liquor. He had once been a Konoha shinobi, until the sixth Hokage had dismissed him. After being exiled from the land of fire and moving from group to group as a rogue shinobi, he had at last fallen so low that he had taken a job for this tiny isolated kingdom. But it seemed that his luck had finally turned. I am going to kill that man today and get my revenge. He was a lightning style user. He'd put on a little show the previous day with the prestigious lightning blade because the Prime Minister had been there, but his specialty was imbuing a shuriken with chakra, transforming that into an electrical current, and hacking an opponent to pieces from a blind spot. The man held his breath and waited for an opening with Kakashi. 12 shinobi surrounded the former Hokage. Some held swords, others readied shuriken, while others watched for a chance to use signs. Still another held his sheathed sword in a reverse grip and turned the scabbard toward Kakashi, ready for attack. For a few seconds, it was a standoff. The first to move was Kakashi, without giving his enemy half a second to toss a shuriken. He danced in close and caught the man's chin with the heel of his palm. In the trees, the man nodded. He would expect nothing less from Kakashi than the nerve to make the first move when surrounded by 12 people. A heartbeat later, the master ninja dodged the sheath that flew at him, like he had eyes on the back of his head. Looking over his shoulder, he deflected the wrist of a man bringing a sword down on him, and then, suddenly, he looked back at the man hiding in the branches. He was sure their eyes met. Instantly, the inside of his body shrank back like a heavy rock had been set in his stomach. Kakashi quickly averted his eyes and sank down in a fluid motion, dodging the lightning-style attack that came from behind. And then he looked at the man again. Those eyes. The man firmed up his trembling hands. Exactly what did one have to witness and know to end up with eyes like the intruder's? He felt like the hard light in those eyes alone could chop his body to pieces. Within one heartbeat, the 12 shinobi had all been knocked to the ground. The man gave up on a surprise attack, climbed down from the tree where he'd been hiding, and revealed himself to Kakashi. He was a dozen yards away. He leaped sideways to close the distance and got as close as 8 yards. He thought that Kakashi had been stabbed dozens of times already, but when he saw him up close, he realized that it was all blood splatter from the other shinobi. Shinakubi? The man lifted his face with a gasp. He yanked out of his thoughts about whether to get closer or jump back. The Lord Hokage actually remembered the face of the man who'd been nothing more than a special jonin. There wasn't a day when the jonin forgot Kakashi's face. Hakubi. Is it a coincidence that you're here? Not so sure. Maybe I slipped in to get revenge on the Lord Hokage. He cut himself off. Kakashi was chuckling for some reason. Feeling like he was being disrespected, he snapped, I'll make you a dead man right here and now. He had come to understand something after watching the fighting. Kakashi wasn't using ninjutsu. He probably had almost no chakra left after maintaining that mud wall for so long. Most of the shinobi had assumed that the wall was a joint project among several people, but if the master of that technique had been the sixth Hokage, then it was a different story. Laughter arose in him. This was the greatest fortune of his life, going one-on-one with the Hokage when he used up his chakra. In his hands, 8 shuriken crackled, imbued with electricity. I've heard the rumors. You don't have the Sharingan anymore. Haven't for a long time. I don't know why you're still hiding one eye, but you better hope you can follow my Raijin shuriken with the regular eyes you were born with. He launched the 8 shuriken, and another 8 at the spot where Kakashi landed after nimbly leaping up to dodge the attack. A heartbeat later, he tossed another 8. The razor-sharp electrical current became one with the shuriken blades, targeting Kakashi from all directions. No matter which way he ran, one of those spinning stars would hit him. Hokage would be glad just to get a few blows in. He was under no delusion that he would be able to defeat the Itachi Kakashi with a single blow. But he was full of chakra. He would rack up bits of damage slowly and make a sport of killing him, like chasing after a wounded animal. Kakashi whirled around and dodged the attacks so swiftly, he was almost a blur. He practically flowed past the shuriken. But there were already 3 blades in his blind spot. Hokage waited with bated breath for the moment when the ninja was cut to pieces. Kakashi pushed the headband hiding his left eye up to his eyebrows. "No," the man gasped. The revealed eye shone darkly red. 3 sinister tomo floated up in the iris. Kakashi was supposed to have lost this special Uchiha ability. But there it was in his left eye. Keen. Kakashi knocked back the shuriken that should have been in his blind spot, and the blades cut into Hakubi's shoulder. A second later, pain raced through him, but that didn't matter. Kakashi of the Sharingan was alive and well? Ridiculous. There was no way. A reliable source had told him that. Kakashi had lost the Sharingan. But he saw my Raijin shuriken and hit them. There's no way you could pull off a trick like without the Sharingan. Completely shaken, Hakubi's reaction was slowed, and Kakashi leaped toward him, filling his field of vision. The heel of Kakashi's palm drove into Hakubi's side, and he didn't even have time to feel nauseous before he lost consciousness. "I can't believe they even had a shinobi from Konoha in their mix," Kakashi muttered with disgust, as he hid his left eye beneath his headband and looked down at the fallen man. Shin Hakubi. He had once been a special jonin in Konohagakure. His skills weren't too bad, but after learning that he had repeatedly robbed civilians while on missions, Kakashi had dismissed him. It looked like he'd made the right decision. He dug into the man's bag looking for weapons, and a number of jewels and gold pieces that he had apparently nicked from the palace tumbled out. Among them was a large blue gemstone with a silver chain through it. He tucked the gem away inside his jacket and turned his gaze toward the artillery camp. The scattered watchfires shone like fireflies. He had already slipped past 49 naked blades. There was one left. The rogue shinobi had decided in advance that if there were reports of intruders, they would race in one after the other. But there was one shinobi who did not abide by this decision. He was the first to notice that the mud wall had been released and assumed that the peasants of Nagar would be heading toward the artillery camp. If he took on the intruder, he would simply be one in a crowd, and his great feats would go unnoticed. It would be easier to take on a bunch of untrained peasants. In his single-minded desire to monopolize all the glory, the man ran like the wind. He sensed the presence of people on the front line of the artillery camp, waving like seaweed. He was sure that it was the peasants foolishly broadcasting their positions as they carried out their clever plan, not knowing how to extinguish their auras. No one would complain if he killed them. Mere commoners full of themselves. He'd murder them all. He smiled slightly, just as darkness fell. The tip of a blood-stained kunai grazed his face. He threw his head back and just barely avoided having his nose cut off. The intruder? He must have gone around ahead of the man. He kicked at the ground trying to put some distance between them in order to leap away, but someone slammed into his back. The intruder that had only a millisecond earlier been in front of him was now behind him. He felt a bump on the back of his neck and instantly sleep overcame him. How can he be that fast? As he hit the ground, the man heard the intruder say quietly, "That makes 50. Nanera and the others managed somehow to slip around to the front of the artillery area, jumping at shadows all the while, expecting to be noticed and shot down at any second. The light of the torches the guards held flickered here and there at even intervals. Perhaps they had noticed that the wall around the village was gone. The soldiers were starting to run around. "Nanera, Be careful. You, too. They exchanged farewells in very quiet voices, and Nanera veered even further out of the way, heading to the rear. Meanwhile, the villagers stayed on the front line so they could pour water on the ammunition powder. Margot held her breath and groped in the darkness to remove the plug on a cannon. She poured water from her leather bag into the pan and stuck a finger in to check that the powder was wet before running over to the next weapon in line. They had to water down the pans of as many cannons as possible as quickly as possible. It was only a matter of time before the guards found them. Just when she had that thought. "Oh. You. What are you doing?" A guard had found her quickly. The plug she'd removed slipped from her hand with a clack. The guard was unarmed. It seemed that the soldiers had been conscripted to use the large artillery and hadn't been given any personal weapons. "Listen. I want you to help us." Margot took a chance and started talking to the guard. "You all were conscripted by the Prime Minister in the capital, right? He made you carry the cannons all this way? It doesn't make sense for you to keep obeying that tyrannical man. Fight together with us." The man stared hard at her face. "You got any chance of winning?" "You saw it, didn't you?" she said quickly. "That enormous earth wall? We've got amazing ninja on our side." "Oh, yeah? Might be worth hearing you out." The man's face softened and he walked toward Margot. "Wonderful. Maybe he'll be an ally." The moment she let out a sigh of relief, something hit Margot in the face. She reeled and fell, pain dancing along her nerves. As she sat up, she realized that she'd been punched in the face. From beneath the pot on her head, she looked up at the man looking down at her with no expression. "Why?" "Sorry, but I can't switch sides," the man said and lit the cannon fuse using the fire of his torch. "My family are being held hostage in the capital. If I go against the Prime Minister, he'll kill them." Margot heard a roar behind her and a projectile shot toward the village of Nagar. Boom! The explosion ripped into his ears, and Nanera shuddered. A cannon had been fired, which meant that persuading the soldiers wasn't going well. "I have to hurry and find my sister." The rear of the camp was silent. There were no people, only equipment and provisions. He was sure Manari would be in the safe area to the rear, far from the front lines, and he looked for her there, but he wasn't having any luck. While he ran around checking each and every tent, the sound of the gunfire grew closer and closer. He appeared to be closing in on the front line to the east. Boom! A cannon jetted orange fire on the west side. He could hear the voices of people fighting in the distance. Their little night mission had taken a chaotic turn. Nanera. Sumir and some adults from the village noticed Nanera and came running over. "Thank goodness you're all okay," he said with relief. "For the time being. Anyway, did you find the queen?" Sumir asked. "No, not yet. My sister and the Prime Minister are nowhere." Nanera started, and a hand reached out from behind to grab him. "If you value the prince's life, don't move." Nanera gasped. He'd heard this voice before. It was the man who had roasted and eaten a lizard in the southern district of the capital. So he had been conscripted too. He struggled to get away, but the hand holding him didn't budge. He almost wondered where this much strength was hiding in such a skinny arm. The man pressed the blade of a knife to Nanera's throat. "Listen, all of you. If you want him to live, throw down your weapons and water bags before the count of 10. 1, 2. Before he could count to 3, there was a clattering sound. "Sumir, don't be foolish. Pick it up." Nanera shouted in a rage at Sumir, who had tossed his hoe aside. "There will be other kings. But if we don't stop the Prime Minister now, this country will be ruined." "Shut up," the man growled and pressed the blade more firmly against the prince's neck. He felt a pinch as it cut into his skin and then the warmth of dripping blood. Another hoe fell on top of the one Samir had thrown aside. Scythes and iron posts clattered to the pile one after another. Why would you all? Nanera was at a loss for words and bit his lip. You all tossed your weapons then? Okay, next, pair up and tie each other's wrists together. The man tossed out the rope coiled at his waist. Then a mass of brown dropped down into the man's face. Ray. Knocking away the knife with his talons, Ray bobbed his head up and down, thrusting his beak at the man's face and head. Gah! What is this? The man twisted around, and Nanera slipped. Free of his grip. The villagers quickly gathered around the man to tie him up with a rope. Ray! Thanks! Nanera called up toward the sky. As if in response, Ray flew up high and circled in the air. Following the hawk's movement with his eyes, Nanera's gaze was drawn to one point in particular. A crimson robe flapped on the cliff to the northeast. The Prime Minister. Nanera squinted and saw Manari next to him. They were up there. To get up to the cliff required a circuitous route over the pass that went fairly far north from the encampment. Even if he had a horse, it was a half-hour's ride from where he stood. But in terms of how the crow flies, it was only 300 meters. There was no time to lose. Nanera began to climb the cliff. End of Chapter 4. Thank you for listening. Remember to like and subscribe for lots more.